And we're back. We're sitting here today with Bob Galligan. Welcome.
Thank you so much.
So happy to have you here. We're also here with our buddy Steve.
Hey, everybody.
Yeah. So super excited to have you here to talk a little bit about some of the work you do, to look at the Minnesota legislature, talk about some of the work that we expect them to do, and really just to jump in and talk a little bit more about the Minnesota cannabis and alcohol industry. But to give people a little bit of background on yourself, what brings you to the Minnesota cannabis industry, or the Minnesota beverage industry, I guess I should say?
Sure, yeah. I mean, we don't have 4 hours, but my story is rather long-winded, but I actually got my degree in acting from the Guthrie and University of Minnesota. And then, as I like to say, I thought to myself, how could I make less money? So I went into craft beer. And at that point, I was living in Austin, Texas. I lived down there for about 6 years and ended up working at a little brewery down there. I was employee 002, so I started on the packaging line, filling 2 cans at a time by hand, seaming 1 at a time. Moved to cellar person, brewer. I was the head brewer for a year and a half, ran the tap room, and then ended up in quality assurance, quality control with a focus on sensory science, which is kind of flavor science. And then when I moved back home in 2017, Surly was hiring a sensory specialist. So I was the quality sensory coordinator at Surly for about 5 years. But then at the tail end of that, I was nominated to the board of the Minnesota Craft Brewers Guild. And then once our executive director left in 2022, somebody had to kind of take over government relations, which I had a little bit of experience with down in Texas. So I applied for that, got there. And worked on legislation in 2022. I thought 2023 was going to be a lot quieter, a lot easier. Hashtag nah.
Shout out to Bauhaus.
So with the legalization of the edible cannabinoids and our members kind of jumping into that market, the onus became on us to kind of take a look at that and begin shaping and working on that, which was super exciting, super frustrating, but also invigorating, just because it's a side, I think, of the cannabis community and cannabis legislation and cannabis itself that no other state has done or tackled the way that we have. So so a lot of it, honestly, majority of my time has been learning, which I thank both of you for all that you have taught me in the past year and a half, which has been immense. And it's an ongoing journey, is learning about the plant itself, but more than anything, the community that surrounds the plant, I think, is the main thing that we still need to get better at, but also continue just hearing the voices and kind of finding our place in this strange kind of part of the cannabis world.
Definitely makes sense. Yeah, I have many memories of being in the Senate chambers or the House chambers really, really late at night and looking over and seeing a few faces that became very well known to me, and yours being one of them. And it was really an exciting time to see that bill actually make its way, not just through committee after committee after committee after committee, but actually making its way across the finish line, being signed and going into effect. What was it like to be able to see? I mean, obviously, seeing legislation pass isn't anything new. What was it like to see cannabis legislation, especially legalization, come about in Minnesota?
Yeah, I mean, a breath of fresh air is one way to put it, I think. Especially from our standpoint as brewers, cannabis has always just been kind of a foreign entity, something that we dare not touch. We ne'er the two shall meet, which is understandable. But at the same time, if you meet a lot of brewers or hang out with a lot of brewers, I'm not going to paint them with a wide brush, but there's a fair amount who are experienced and understand the world of cannabis. So it's not a foreign territory necessarily, and one that I think in the state of Minnesota, I think the general population has just been very frustrated that legalization kept getting pushed off and pushed off and pushed off, just because the majority of Minnesotans, I think, have always been very, very progressive and wanting the legalization. So the fact that it took us this long, I think, is somewhat of a headache for a lot of people. So finally seeing that board light up green was historic and felt really good. But then just from a personal experience, yeah, I mean, 33 different committee stops. It was just a long, arduous Strog. What am I trying to think? It was a hard time, and it wore me the hell down. So finally, the last day of the actual passage, I think I got to the Senate chamber at 10 a.m. and I think I left at 2:30 a.m. the next day. Going through that, but actually seeing the entire process was super interesting, and even not just for my membership, but even on my social media, actually posting about committee meetings and posting about actual floor votes and stuff. Some of the feedback I got back was a lot of people saying, I never really understood the pathway of legislation. So this has been really helpful to actually understand how this is going, mostly because, if there was a hiccup to be had legislatively, House File 100 had it. So that I think was kind of eye-opening for a lot of people as to how many hurdles there are to jump through, and that it's not just somebody writing a piece of paper and all of a sudden it becomes law. So, yeah, it was an uphill battle, but again, one that in the end, when you actually see it cross the finish line, is feels pretty good.
Totally, Bob. So tell me a little bit about the Craft Brewers Guild and liken it to an organization or an association that the cannabis industry has, or not necessarily specific, but like what is the Craft Brewers Guild trying to accomplish year in and year out?
Yeah, I mean, generally the Craft Brewers Guild, we are there to promote, protect the craft brewers of Minnesota. So, rule number one, especially from a legislative side of things, which is funny because the Guild was not always legislatively minded. It was not always kind of the branch of brewing that tackled legislation. We have now kind of become that, but rule number one is just don't lose any rights that you're currently granted. So no matter what, at the Capitol, any Capitol, there's consistently different stakeholders that are trying to, better their interest. And 9 times out of 10, if it's bettering their interests, it probably is minimizing ours. So just keeping an eye on legislation, making sure that, there's nothing super harmful that comes our way. But then on top of that, promoting, anything that can actually expand our rights and what we're allowed to do. Obviously, we are on board for and fighting for. But also from a promotion standpoint, like we, the longest running beer festival in Minnesota, Autumn Brew Review, we started 21 years ago. And so we still hold that every autumn. The largest beer festival, All Pints North, which happens in Duluth every July, that is ours as well. So promoting from a kind of getting everyone together to celebrate craft beer for sure. And a lot of our job too, especially me on the industry side of things, is trying to stay in touch with members and then kind of disseminate that information either to the other membership or to the press or to, legislators, kind of all over the place. And I also, as Director of Government Industry Relations, I also interact with a lot of like our allied trade members. So those are ingredient suppliers, people who have connected stakes in our industry that aren't necessarily brewers, hearing their side of things as well and trying to disseminate that. So, a lot of it is just... most of my job is getting yelled at and then finding ways not to yell back. That's most of it.
So you've been here to sort of see that change in cannabis go from not technically legalized low-potency edibles to then formally legalized low-potency edibles to now sort of the adult use onboarding that we're seeing come about. What was that reception like in the alcohol industry? We've talked to like Andy at Modest who said, they were generally pretty receptive to introducing cannabis and figuring out how to work with that. But across the board, what does craft brewing generally sort of think about cannabis and how has that evolved?
Yeah, super good question. I think, again, the actual substance of THC is not a foreign one to the brewing industry. But having said that, again, where do we interact and how do we benefit each other and how do we not step on each other's toes is a question that not only are we currently asking, but we have been asking and will be asking for the foreseeable future. But I think at the end of the day, there's a lot of crossover that's super beneficial and helpful for both communities and both industries. I think, at the end of the day, alcohol is a little bit more wary of cannabis, just because, especially on a federal level, you still have, it's technically illegal on the federal side. So that, I think, makes a lot of, especially the large players, a little bit more hesitant. That's one of the interesting things about the market that we have here in Minnesota, and kind of the hemp-derived THC beverage market is, ultimately, a lot of the power kind of lies in the smaller producers' hands, just because you don't have huge conglomerates that are trying to jump in this space right now, because it is such a gray area in every single other state except Minnesota. So from our standpoint, it really is the small producer who finally, for the first time since Prohibition, has the upper hand and has some say. And to me, that's really invigorating and really exciting, just because, even in the actual beer world, it took us a long time for us as smaller producers to have our voice heard on any level. So to kind of start from a place where our voice is heard is unexpected, but also, the onus is now on us not to mess that up and be good stewards. But in a broader level, I think there is still some questions, from national trade organizations and some of those larger companies as to exactly what our place is. And I think it's going to depend on everyone and how they feel comfortable operating the space to find that. I mean, I still, have members. There's still members of the Craft Brewers Guild that don't think that THC is our place, that we're brewers, we're beer brewers, and that's what we should be focusing on. And I completely understand that point of view. At the same time, almost 90% of our membership either are operating in this space or thinking about operating in this space. So obviously that's, that means it's something that we got to take very seriously and act accordingly and responsibly. So I think it is this kind of tight rope that we are walking. But again, I don't necessarily think that we're going to stop walking it anytime soon. I think as long as we keep our wits about us and again, more than anything, listening is a lot of our job, I find, just as to, what it is that we can be doing better, or what it is that, we can trade information on, I think is the most important part, just so long as we're listening and actually working together. That's ultimately the goal. Whether or not we're able to succeed at that goal, we'll find out. But, yeah.
I think brands can solve a lot of these issues by sourcing locally.
Mm-hmm.
Like sourcing matters, and you make a lot of farmers happy if you're starting to buy from Minnesota farmers.
100%.
I think everybody, both cannabis sides, both cannabis and cannabis and alcohol can get behind that.
100%. And that's, especially as craft producers, we care very much about the ingredients that we're actually using in our products to create our products. So, even at the beginning of discussions on House File 100 and our place on it, we made it very clear that we support Minnesota grown, Minnesota extracted, Minnesota introduced, Minnesota stored, Minnesota sold, as best as we can. And part of the hard part is, how do you actually source that from a state that doesn't have an explosive hemp market, that doesn't have an explosive cannabis market? And so I think that's part of the headache here. But as long as, like you said, we're paying attention and supporting as local as we can, that's super important.
Very cool. So there's a couple bills that are being looked at the legislative session that we already know about just in the first few days. One of which was focused on allowing for on-tap THC beverages. And then the other was removing that 5-hour rule, or the rule basically saying you're not allowed to serve cannabis beverages within 5 hours of also serving an alcohol beverage. I wanted to ask you first your thoughts on those before moving on to a couple other measures. So just generally, what are your thoughts on those two changes?
Those thoughts are my priorities. So those are primarily what I'm looking at. I think we even during conference committee of last year in the passage of House File 100, we knew the 5-hour rule was going to be a headache, and we tried to change that. Ultimately, everything was so chaotic, especially there at the end. It was just kind of decided that House File 100 will pass as is, and we will address it later. And we were okay with that because honestly, we're still operating under this temporary change to 15172, which is the edible cannabinoids. Ultimately, that 5-hour rule falls under what was Article 1 of House File 100, which will kick into gear March 2025, or when the Office of Cannabis Management is up and running. So we kind of knew that we'd have this session to chip away and to address that. Very much so. I mean, I think the spirit behind the 5-hour rule is 100% correct. Like, I get why that 5-hour rule is there. Public health ultimately is top of mind and the most important thing, and cannot disagree with that whatsoever. Having said that, I think it is literally impossible to enforce. I don't think there is any way to actually know if somebody comes in and says that they have not had alcohol in the past 5 hours. The only way you know if they're lying is if they are acting intoxicated, which is what the current language is just we can't serve to somebody who is intoxicated. Mixing of the actual substances, we do know that crossfading is something that is, it happens. It is not just out in the ether there somewhere. And we know more than anything, it kind of amplifies the effects. So your intoxication happens quicker. And that's, completely fair. But again, the only way to know if that actual crossfading is happening is if that person then begins acting intoxicated. So it's kind of putting the cart before the horse in our mind. So looking at that 5-hour rule and kind of, seeing how we do things in alcohol, this is one of those areas where I think we're looking at how we operate in alcohol, and we can learn something on the cannabis side from how we're doing that. The way that we're, addressing this and kind of modeling what we want to see is pretty much mimicking the way that we operate under the alcohol. So again, just making sure that you don't serve to somebody who's intoxicated, but also, making sure that people are trained to look for those signs of intoxication. What are those signs of intoxication? Do they look different than alcohol? So making sure that bartenders are well trained and that there's regulation in place to make it safe. Ultimately, that's what it comes down to. We want to make sure that people are comfortable at the bar, whether they're imbibing THC or alcohol or having one of each. We just want to make sure that they're safe.
From a trend standpoint, feedback standpoint, what do you hear from operators as far as like number of beverages consumed, or are they consuming at the same pace of an alcohol beverage? Perhaps less, perhaps, I don't know, but maybe you've heard good feedback from brewery operators.
Yeah. I mean, I think the consumer behaves very differently with THC beverages. One of the main things, even after, people first started selling on-premise consumption after the edible cannabinoid bill passed, consumption tends to slow down as you have more with these THC beverages, whereas with alcohol it ramps up. So knowing that in your consumer, I think is super important. But it also, it's to a degree a different vibe that I think they bring to it. Like I got to go to Trail Magic. Was it last February? Had their THC tap room.
November 2022.
It was November. Woo! Anyway, I got to go and experience that, and it was, it was so interesting to sit in a tap room, and it was quiet, which was
it didn't get louder as the night went on.
No, it turns out, and it was really really cool because you had these 23-year-old hipsters off in the corner, but then you also had, this 70-year-old lesbian couple in the corner imbibing. Like it was really fascinating to see just how broad of a consumer these products were reaching, and I think that kind of, to a certain degree, made me start to realize and feel safe. Almost.
If you don't feel safe in the Bent Paddle Canna Lounge,
yeah, something's wrong. But even just safe in operating in that space. And I think that again, I think there's always cause for concern with something new. And again, Minnesota is going about things in a way that has never been done. But I think also to the citizens and the consumers' credit, and also it's super helpful when going and approaching legislators. The sky hasn't fallen. We haven't seen like a huge uptick in traffic accidents. We haven't seen anything really catastrophically bad happen like some people were expecting to see. And I think a lot of that I think reassures both us as producers, but also the consumer market and those writing laws that people are taking this and acting responsibly.
Very cool.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah. So I have some questions for you on what other changes you'd like to see both to the hemp side and then also to the cannabis side as well. But first, let's take a very short break here.
Hey, Tanner.
Hey, Steve.
What are you doing?
I'm just reading, getting ready for our next event. You know, what to expect when you're expecting.
An inspection? What are you talking about?
No, our March event. You know, what to expect when you're expecting. I'm getting ready so I can teach more about, people getting ready for having babies.
Let me see this. Tanner, this is a pregnancy Bible.
I know. You texted me, a couple weeks back saying we're going to have an event called What to Expect When You're Expecting in March. And so I figured I'd start getting ready.
Okay. Well, I'm sure that's great and all. And I know, you're getting married and I know things are, heating up for you, but we're not hosting a pregnancy class, Tanner. We're hosting a compliance class about what to expect when you're expecting an inspection. Remember?
Oh, an inspection.
An inspection, like if your retail store has non-compliant products, you may expect an inspection. And, if you sell THCA flower, you might get an inspection.
Oh, so we're not going to teach people about pregnancy, but more about when the state comes out to inspect your legal cannabis business, what to expect?
Yeah, an inspection, March 21st. It's at the Wilderness. Hell, you created this class. Come on, silly. This is totally different. We're talking about the cannabis industry.
Get your tickets today. mncannabiscollege.org/inspection. What to expect when you're expecting
An inspection.
Yeah.
It's okay.
All right. And we're back. So we talked about 2 changes, that on-tap rule and the 5-hour rule. What other changes are you looking and hoping are brought up in the legislature either this year or in the future on that hemp edible and beverage side?
Yeah, on the hemp side of things, I think we're in a really interesting place. One, I think the onus is, it's up to us to see where this market goes, because it is such a new market, because no one has done it the way that we have. I think we need to be ready to be very responsive into what the market is asking for and how can we best provide that to the market. And again, what further regulation can we chip away at? There's nothing specifically right now that we are looking to address besides that kind of on-premise area, mostly because we want to see exactly how things start to shape out. One of the interesting things to come into play is now you're actually seeing traditional wholesalers and distributors play more in this market, which is super interesting. They were very wary off the get-go. So kind of seeing, what their place is in it is really interesting. We definitely think, the whole purpose behind kind of our work on these beverages and House File 100 and beyond is, one, normalizing and taking away the stigma of these products in spaces that they aren't traditionally sold or consumed in. But then also with that, really equating these beverages to beer in particular, beer more than, spirits, obviously, or even wine. And so to see wholesalers kind of jump into that and start to kind of see where we were going and what we were trying to achieve is refreshing. And I think there are, post-prohibitions, there are aspects of the 3-tier system that are absolutely in place for the right reasons and awesome. However, we also know that the 3-tier system has some major flaws and some chips. It is not a perfect system. So I do think that there are some people out there that are literally just trying to copy and paste the 3-tier system and move it over into cannabis or hemp-derived in particular. And I don't think that that's necessarily the way to go, but I think the discussion is at a place where we can begin talking about exactly how do we market kind of how it gets to point A to point B. But other than that, on the hemp side, again, I think we're in a just interesting place to see what happens. And once actual dispensaries open up and full adult use really comes into play, what does that do to the market? I'm really excited to see. Yeah.
Are you surprised at all at the adoption of cannabis beverages as a medium, like the 12-ounce can being the medium that breaks down the barriers for 60-plus-year-old men and women?
Yeah, well, I mean, and that's if you've listened to any interview I've done, it's a talking point of mine. But I do really think it's interesting in that these beverages and what my members are producing are not necessarily marketed, or the target audience is not the person who is super familiar with cannabis, who knows their terps, who, all of that. It's like, when the edible cannabinoid bill passed in 22, I still heard from a lot of my friends who were cannabis users, like, oh, Minnesota legalized 3.2 weed. Great. Like, this is, of course we did this in the dumbest way possible.
Bud Light.
Yeah. And I totally understand that. Having said that, I think the way that we did it is super interesting and actually ultimately beneficial for the entire market, because I do think, as I like to say, the consumer of most of our products are going to be kind of the athlete with joint pain, or the 70-year-old grandmother who wants to sleep better. People who would not traditionally visit a dispensary now are willing to, go to their grocery store and get a six-pack, or a liquor store and get, cans of these and take them home and see whether or not THC is a benefit to their lifestyle. And ultimately, if they do, they'll come back and they'll buy another six-pack, they'll come back, they'll buy another four-pack. And then long-term, if they find out that THC truly is a benefit, they're going to the dispensary, and they begin to actually, experience that kind of realm of things. So, again, I think that it is surprising to a certain degree, but it shouldn't be to a certain point, because it is, like I said, it's a little bit more. And that's kind of when I say we're trying to equate it to beer. That's kind of what I mean is, like, you go to the bar, you have a beer or two, and then if you decide that you enjoy it, you might try whiskey, and then you're in a liquor store, and then it kind of broadens it up. So this is just kind of, in my opinion, a lot of what our beverages do is opening a door to the market.
Has the Brewers Guild seen outreach from, say, like South Dakota, Iowa, any of the surrounding states, or have you heard from breweries around the Midwest about, hey, what's going on up there?
Yeah. I mean, post passage of House File 100, I would say this last summer, a majority of my week was spent fielding questions from people from other states. I know Arizona right now is looking at introducing legislation. They wanted me to fly out and talk to legislators about kind of how we're doing this in Minnesota, Connecticut. Some people just reached out. So, I mean, I think it's starting to get looked at for sure, and it's definitely being murmured about in other states about how we're going about things, which again is in my opinion great, because I think it is a step in the right direction. As for actual surrounding states, I haven't heard as much, and I think part of that is just the legalization efforts are not quite where they need to be in those surrounding states currently. I think once they see what's happening in Minnesota and the tax revenue and the jobs that we create, I think maybe they'll take a look.
I'm actually hearing that in college towns in Iowa that they're selling THC beverages.
I don't doubt that. College town would be a fine place to do it. But I think it is really interesting, because there is a fair amount of states across the country that ultimately are operating in this super gray area. And I know especially a lot of actual kind of Republican-led states are really taking a hands-off approach. They basically, especially with these hemp beverages, are just saying basically, the federal government, according to the Farm Bill of 2018, says that these are fine, so they're fine. We're not going to regulate them any further, which, I think opens up the market, and that's great. But at the same time, for us in Minnesota, it was like, it's a very beautiful open market. Now, how do we make it safe, and how do we make sure the doses are right, and how do we actually label this correctly? So taking the first step of actually, putting our foot forward and saying, not only is this legal, but it should be legal and regulated, and as a state, let's actually get money from it that we can put back into regulation.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
So one parallel that people have made is looking at the micro business license that was created in House File 100, and sort of that craft tap room, the culture that really was sort of built up in Minnesota over the last decade or so. You perhaps know the alcohol industry better than any of our guests that we've had on. And also, cannabis. And I was curious a little bit on your thoughts on if you see any parallels between those two, if you see perhaps in the future a similar culture developing around that micro business on-site consumption sort of environment, or sort of what your thoughts are on what adult use might bring to our industry as it is today.
Yeah, absolutely. I do see very strong parallels in especially the craft brewing community and the cannabis community. And more than anything, and I think you bringing the micro business up is important. the community is that part, is that connecting dot. As I like to say, especially during the pandemic, as craft brewers, we take care of our community, and in turn, the community takes care of us, which we saw people coming out and buying, beer to go throughout the pandemic when our tap rooms were closed. If you're not actually caring about the people that, you are surrounded by, then I think you're in trouble in this type of business model. And so I think that definitely is crossover and I think important to both those who celebrate cannabis as well as craft beer. One thing that I also think, craft brewing has done that I think cannabis can take a page out of is really trying to bring producers and business owners together as much as possible. And there are some groups out there on the cannabis side that are doing that and doing a good job. On the brewing side, there's us as a guild. There's also the National Trade Brewers Association. I think having a central point in Denver for the Great American Beer Festival every year, that's kind of a pilgrimage for a lot of, craft beer drinkers, is to finally go out and experience the culture in Colorado, one of the main hubs and homes of craft brewing. I think finding those types of areas in cannabis and those spaces to bring people together and to celebrate that community, I think is ultimately super, super important, and to do so in a spirit of celebration. Collaboration more than anything, I think is super important. On the state level, as a guild, like I said, I can't say that, all of us get along splendidly 100% of the time, on the brewing side of things. But, having an organization that actually is there to support and to listen, to all members, I think is super important. And like I said, I know that there are definitely some groups that are doing that in cannabis. I just haven't seen one kind of emerge necessarily. But that is also kind of, part of my concern with cannabis is I don't want to see it splinter, the community splinter. And so, craft beer has been around here since 1978. And we've definitely had our differences, but I don't think any of us have necessarily splintered. So how can we, again, keep a unified voice, I think is super important, and to always remember the celebratory side of it, because at the end of the day, you're dealing with cannabis, you're dealing with craft beer for your work. Ultimately, life isn't that bad.
Bob, you're a good follow on Instagram, and lately I've been seeing you doing research around like the historical center, maybe the library. What are you digging into right now? What can you share, and not necessarily what you're doing, but like what are you seeing? Like I see you're digging through these old files, and there's a long history of beer in this state. So maybe some of the highlights that you've been seeing lately or digging into.
Yeah, it's been a fascinating little project. Part of that is legislative. I can't go too far into it, but we are looking for a specific date to celebrate beer in the state of Minnesota. Just because Minnesota, like you said, has a very long, storied history with brewing, being right at the headwaters of the Mississippi. So I've been doing a lot of research as to the very old brewers who, the first one was Anthony Yorg in 1848, so 10 years before Minnesota became a state. Still can't find the specific date they opened up, but we're working on it. And then, seeing past that, I mean, a lot of people don't realize, but actually before Minnesota was a state, we had a territorial prohibition, that only lasted a couple of months before it wasn't even a Supreme Court at that time, but one of the judges struck it down as unconstitutional. Diving into some of those type of particular histories, but then on top of that too, I'm a St. Paul boy, born and raised, and Minnesota is the land of sky blue waters. Hams was one of the, I believe, top 5 breweries in the United States there for a little while. So really celebrating the culture and the impact that had on brewing. I very much love like old 1950s, 60s brewing advertisements. That kind of stuff hits me in a deep nostalgic way, and I don't exactly know why, but finding out kind of some of the more history of Hams and some of those larger breweries. I mean, it's fascinating too how much hams supported their workforce. And how they were ingrained in the community. I mean, the St. Paul Winter Carnival was basically funded by hams for years. Even when they moved they had 2 breweries out in California, they would have, parade floats at the Rose Bowl every year. Like, I mean, it was a very strong history. And even when you look online at some of these, old timers, when you hear people whose father or grandfather worked at hams, like all of them had a wonderful experience, and that the brewery really took care of them in the east side of St. Paul. And again, it is kind of that community mentality. It's a much larger business that's doing it, but it still maintained that kind of community connection. And so kind of remembering that and connecting that to the small spirit that is American craft beer now, where again do we intersect, I think is super important. But it was interesting on my Instagram, somebody, a Cannabis colleague, reached out, was like, this is pretty cool. And, I messaged them back. They own a business. I was like, well, imagine in 110 years when somebody's looking back at these and they see a flyer of yours, this is a whole new industry that there will be history on, in particular in Minnesota, because of the way that we've kind of gone about things.
Yeah, we love it. We have a training manual that is, and the recording of this just coming out, but by the time this podcast come out, will already be out. Mm-hmm. That includes a little bit of sections about the history of hemp here in Minnesota. And similar to alcohol, it's one of those things that just sort of interweaves into Minnesota history in spots you might not expect. And, we have like advertisements from newspapers back in like the early 1900s saying like, grow hemp for profit, come to Minnesota.
Hell yeah.
It's
Jackson,
a long
Minnesota.
history. Yeah, exactly.
Blue
Earth, like all these places. So,
Blue Earth was one, really.
Yeah, it's a huge spot out of there. You had Canico Inc. You had Kempka. Don't quote me on that. I'll get you the names afterwards. But yeah, a long history of hemp, and spent a decent amount of time at that Gale Family Library as well.
Oh yes,
stuff,
that's awesome. So. It is. It's a weird library, but yes, yeah. I had to do some research on the cards.
Yeah,
it's a process. So if anyone wants to do research, come talk to Tanner and I, apparently, because you don't just walk in there and say, "Can I get a book?"
All right. Well, sort of wrapping
up. Speaking of books,
yeah. So wrapping up a little bit today. You mentioned your Instagram page is a place to go and get some information, but where else would you send people to go and connect with you to learn a little bit more about your organization, or just to get in touch with you? Yeah,
mncraftbrew.org is the Guild's website, and definitely check it out, especially for a lot of our events and whatnot. All the ticket sales go through there. We do at one point we had a policy page, trying to get that kind of back up and running, to kind of just lay out some of the legislative stuff that we're working on, but it's not currently active, so don't go there yet. But other than that, I think social media is a good place to follow me personally if you want. It's not that great of a follow, but it is a follow. And I do post about the legislative process. But also, I would say, at the end of the day, if you want to keep up with kind of what's happening in the industry, go visit your local tap room, and get either an IPA or a THC beverage. Because at the end of the day, it really is about that kind of, hand across the bar that's serving you that we're about. And, maybe you'll come across one of the members that isn't doing THC, and has no idea what we're doing. But for the most part at this point, most breweries are at least kind of kept up to speed as to where we're at and kind of where we tend to go.
Awesome. Well, thank you again so much for coming out today. We really appreciate it.
No, thank you for having me. Pleasure, gentlemen.
Thanks, Bob.